So, following Luke Rockhold's devastating loss to Darren Till on Misfits, Luke Rockhold's decided to retire. Now, this is a decision that has come many years too late because Luke Rockhold's been finished for a very long time and needed to retire a long time ago. But he's finally decided to call it quits after getting, violently knocked out by Darren Till again. And they've been knocked out by Till before, but they've been knocked out violently a number of times leading into this fight. Now, you look at Luke Rockhold's career, and realistically, after he won the title and lost to Michael Bisping, hindsight being 2020, he should have retired after that. But of course he didn't, and he took long layoffs, which don't help. Took long layoffs, came back, didn't improve, only got worse, only became more chinny, only had less sort of power, and became less dangerous, less of a threat, and just got beaten up by a lot of guys in the UFC. But Luke Rockhold would then leave the UFC, and then would have this fight with Misfits against Darren Till, and Darren Till would violently knock him out. Luke Rockhold's a guy who's had a decent career. I mean, more than a decent career. He's a Strikeforce champion and UFC champion. He's had more than a decent career. He's had a career that a lot of MMA fighters would have died to have. But when you look at what Luke Rockhold is, he's a guy who's a very good grappler and a guy who had a limited striking game, but at times could prove to be effective, particularly with his kicks, because he had really long legs and was quite a lanky guy. Those kicks were quite the weapon for Luke Rockhold throughout his MMA career, but his boxing was always poor. His boxing technique, he didn't have a ton of power in his hands either. And like I said, the technique was quite poor, so even if he had power, if the technique's poor, it almost doesn't even matter. But particularly defensively, his boxing defensive mechanics have always been pretty awful. And guys have been able to find his chin consistently throughout his career. When he was younger, you could get away with it because you're younger. Or maybe he was using more grappling in those fights, so he wouldn't be standing with guys as much. But as he got older, those boxing defensive fundamentals didn't improve. Knocked out by Michael Bisping, knocked out by Yoel, knocked out by a number of guys. And then again, you put him in against Darren Till, a guy who's proved at this level of Misfits, still dangerous, still got power. If anything, he's still got a lot of power. Southpaw as well was always going to be a tricky customer, especially Darren Till. Even in MMA, Darren Till in MMA against a guy like Luke Rockhold. Luke Rockhold would have the big advantage in grappling, but in terms of the striking, it would have been a pretty similar result, even if it was an MMA fight. Darren Till probably would have banged him out pretty early in the fight because Luke Rockhold's just not got the chin for it anymore. That being said, Darren Till goes out there, he gets a big knockout against Luke Rockhold, and that was all she wrote for him. And, you put a guy in there who's got bad boxing fundamentals for MMA, and you put him in a boxing match. Right, what do you think's going to happen? And this guy's older and slower and more chinny. And again, like I said before, doesn't have the boxing defensive fundamentals. What do you think is going to happen? Right? So Luke Rockhold, he gets knocked out and he retires. Hopefully that's it for him. I don't want to see him. I mean, he had a bare knuckle boxing match. I don't want to see him do any sort of combat sports anymore. If he wants to do some grappling matches, he can do that. I mean, no one watches. I don't know. I don't watch grappling matches, but I'm sure there's people that do watch them. So if he wants to do that, then by all means. But I hope his days of getting hit in the head are done, because how many more times do you need to get knocked out, right? How many more times do you need to get knocked out? Does he need the money? I hope he doesn't, because he's been in MMA for a long time, and no doubt I'm sure would have got a decent payday against Darren Till. So I hope he doesn't need the money, but if he does, then he does. And at the end of the day, he's a grown man; he can do what he wants. But hopefully that is it for Luke Rockhold, because he's had a decent career, more than a decent career. He had a great career. He's a UFC world champion. He's had a great career, but honestly, the way he's gone out once he lost the belt, the way he went out, it's the sort of thing that does take away from your legacy. It does. It always does. These things always take away from your legacy. I saw it with Tony Ferguson. People are saying, well, he went on a 12-fight win streak, so you can't take that away from his legacy. Yes, you can. If you go on a 12-fight winning streak, then go on a 7-fight losing streak, your legacy's done, bro. And it calls into question your 12 wins. Like, how good were you? Because to lose 7 times in a row is an embarrassment, right? That being said, Luke Rockhold hasn't lost 7 in a row, but he's lost a lot. He's lost a lot and taken a lot of damage throughout those losses as well. So yeah, like I said for the millionth time, hopefully that's it for Luke Rockhold. But yeah, be curious to know what you guys think. Do you think Luke Rockhold will stay retired, or do you think he might come back down the line? Be curious to know what you guys think in the comments below. And yeah, another episode of the Seth solo side quest in the bag, and I'm out. Peace.